Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. What's new, Mark?
New in Seattle is this is the time of year when we say goodbye to the sun and say hello to the cold and gray, which will be our daily companion for the next several months.
Okay, well, we're having Indian summer here in New York, so I feel guilty. Or is that now Native American summer?
Indigenous Peoples Summer, perhaps.
Yes. Okay, with no further ado, let's get to our topic. And Mark, I need you to mansplain this for me. What's the deal with self-driving cars? I feel like we've been promised this technological innovation for years now. It's got to be at least a decade ago, the first time I heard that driven cars will be replaced by self-driving cars. And yet nothing has really happened apart from occasional articles in the newspaper about people getting killed in testing and all kinds of regulatory machinations by the various companies. It feels like self-driving cars are still way far away from becoming a reality. So I asked you to look into this. So please do tell me, Mark, what is the deal with self-driving cars?
Thanks for this question, Joe. As I mentioned at the end of our previous episode, I've followed the development of self-driving cars closely. This despite the fact that I personally have never owned a car. I just found the topic really interesting. And I confess that I am really looking forward to when self-driving cars will be common on our city streets, partly because I think the technology is cool, but also because, as a pedestrian and a cyclist, I've had many close encounters with irresponsible drivers, and my hope is that self-driving cars have the potential to be less dangerous.
Okay.
The research on self-driving cars goes back several decades. Way back in the 1970s, researchers in Japan developed a car that would drive itself along special roads that were equipped with an elevated rail that guided the car's path. The industry didn't really pick up steam, though, until the DARPA Grand Challenges. Do you remember these, Joe?
No, never heard of it.
Well, the first Grand Challenge was on March 13th, 2004, and it promised a $1 million prize to the first team whose car could autonomously navigate a 150-mile route through the Mojave Desert. The route wasn't identified until shortly before the race, so the cars would have to navigate unfamiliar terrain.
Can you just tell our listeners what DARPA is?
DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project. It's basically the R&D arm of the defense industry, and it is funded by Congress to investigate basically moonshots, big, long-reaching research projects which may not have immediate applications, but if the science comes together, they could be transformative.
Right. So that's a subject that's come up in this podcast before, especially in our episode about autonomous drones.
Indeed it has. I was sitting at my computer that day, watching the contest live, and so I was one of the people who was mildly disappointed by the outcome. None of the competitors managed to make it more than 11 miles into the race, and no one took home the prize. But DARPA announced that they'd hold another Grand Challenge 1 year later, so those teams were able to go back to the drawing board and improve their designs. This time, the course was 132 miles long, and 5 teams were able to finish the course. The winning car, designed by a team from Stanford, finished the course in just over 7 hours. 2 years later, DARPA followed up with another Grand Challenge, this time testing autonomous cars navigating a simulated urban environment. The cars had to navigate a 60-mile course and obey all traffic regulations while negotiating with other cars, avoiding obstacles, and merging into traffic. This time, a team from Carnegie Mellon won, with Stanford coming in second. At the time, I remember thinking that self-driving cars were right around the corner, but it's been 15 years since the Urban Challenge, so what happened? Well, the first thing that happened was a bunch of self-driving car companies were founded, and their first order of business was to get state law changed. 15 years ago, it was actually illegal to operate self-driving cars on public streets.
Right.
California was pretty quick to open its door to companies testing their vehicles, though, as did other states in the Southwest. And to this day, most testing is done in those same states. Partly that's for convenience, as a lot of these companies are based in California, but there are also technological reasons. A typical self-driving car uses a variety of technologies to tell the car what's going on in the environment. They are equipped with high-resolution cameras, detailed maps of the roads, sonar systems, and something called LiDAR, which is a method for measuring the distance of an object by bouncing laser light off of it. When these systems are working properly, they can provide a detailed three-dimensional map of the environment that the car is operating in, but fog and bad weather can screw things up pretty quickly. That's why California, Utah, and other hot and dry areas are a good place for the early stages of self-driving technology development. And these companies needed to log lots and lots of miles because they needed real-world examples of what shows up on streets and highways in order to program those things into their software. Automated cars use a type of machine learning called neural networks. In principle, neural networks try to simulate the way neurons function in the human brain. They're fed inputs, or test data, and they're also supplied with a desired output. For example, in the scenario of a self-driving car, the inputs would include things like the image of another car traveling down the road, and the desired output would be something like continuing to drive down the road without running headlong into that other car. The network processes the inputs and compares its output to the desired output programmed into the system. Over thousands and thousands of generations, it refines its approach and develops its own method of getting from the one to the other.
This is machine learning, is it not?
Yes, and it's a proven method of developing artificial intelligence, and it's had some brilliant successes lately. For instance, computers are now better at chess, Go, and poker than even the best human players. But machine learning relies on a huge amount of test data. Waymo, the self-driving car company that spun off from Google, has logged about 90 million miles on the roads, and its software has driven billions of miles in simulated environments. No other company has driven that many miles, but there are a number of companies testing their cars on the roads, and in the process, accidents and some deaths have happened. The first driver of a self-driving car to die in a crash was in China back in 2016, but the first death to get a lot of press was a pedestrian who was struck and killed by a self-driving car that was being tested by Uber in March of 2018. A woman named Elaine Hertzberg was pushing her bicycle across the street in Tempe, Arizona, when she was struck by a self-driving vehicle that failed to avoid her. Later, when investigators examined the car's telemetry, they saw that the car had detected her 6 seconds prior to the collision. Initially, the AI classified her as an unknown object, and then as a vehicle, and finally as a bicycle. And all three of these classifications had a different predicted path and rate of speed according to the logic of the car's system. 1.3 seconds before the crash, the system determined that emergency braking was required, but in the Uber test parameters, the car was not designed to alert the safety driver, and also was not able to apply the emergency brake itself because apparently there had been so many false positives in the past that the feature had been disabled to reduce the potential for erratic driving behavior. In a nutshell, Uber was counting on the safety driver to notice and intervene, but she failed to do so. There were some reports that she might have been watching a streaming video at the time.
Yeah, well, that's a problem.
After an investigation, the county prosecutor declined to charge Uber with a crime, but charges of negligent homicide are still pending against the safety driver.
So, Mark, one of the reasons for my skepticism about the prospects for self-driving cars is that these types of situations, malfunctions that lead to crashes and deaths, continue to happen. Just in yesterday's New York Times, there was the latest story about where a Tesla's autopilot software sometimes fails to detect emergency vehicles that have their lights flashing, and that problem alone led to at least 12 crashes and 1 death quite recently. So it's hard for my brain to accept the idea of self-driving cars being imminent if these things continue to happen.
Yeah. It's clearly still a work in progress, and we will be going through some of those other accidents that you speak about. But for now, if we step back to this Uber crash, clearly a lot of things went wrong in this case. but I suspect that, at its most basic, this was a failure of machine learning. This was a pedestrian crossing in the middle of the block instead of at a crosswalk, pushing a bicycle that was loaded down with multiple bags. The system had trouble identifying what it was looking at, and so it failed to slow down or steer around her. Machine learning and image recognition has gotten a lot better the past few years, but there are still points at which the systems can fail in a spectacular way. If you train a neural network on images of cats, it will get very good at identifying when it's looking at another picture of a cat. If you show it a picture of a cat in a Halloween costume, though, it will be stumped. Current AI systems lack the human brain's capacity to extrapolate from incomplete information, and when they get confused, the results can be unpredictable.
Yeah. It's strange, though, how if you can't identify a pedestrian exactly, and maybe you identify it as a bicycle or another car or whatever, like in your prior example, at least the computer should understand that it identified the oncoming thing as something, therefore stop. That's the part I don't understand. Maybe it can't identify a cat in a Halloween costume, but it knows that something is there, so just stop the friggin' car. Why doesn't it stop? I don't get that.
Well, I think the reason is just how machine learning works and some of the pitfalls within that technology. You might have heard about a recent controversy involving Google's image search. Google Search has the capacity to identify what a photo shows and suggest other photos that show the same thing. This feature is powered by machine learning. But recently, someone noticed that Google was misidentifying photos of black men as gorillas.
Oh my God.
Google was, of course, appalled at this fact, but they weren't able to fix the problem. The best they were able to do was remove gorillas and other monkeys from the list of things that their neural network would identify within images. Neural networks are kind of like a black box. After they've been trained and start making decisions, it's very hard to go back and deduce why they made this decision instead of that one. And that means that fixing a self-driving car system so that it recognizes a person pushing a bicycle is actually very hard to do. And that's only one of the difficult identification scenarios you might confront. You can feel confident about situations that arise frequently, but the less common something is, the more likely that your system will not know how to react, and you may not know that the problem exists until it shows up in the real world. As I mentioned, there have been other fatalities. I've been able to find reports of 14 other deaths, all of them within Teslas. In many of these cases, you can see that something unusual happened so that the self-driving AI did not have rules for how to react. Often the accident involved a vehicle parked on the shoulder of the road. Several times it involved a self-driving car colliding with a trailer. In more than one of these cases, the car tried to continue driving after the crash as if nothing had happened.
Right. And I'm thinking a deer crossing the road would probably confound the computer as well, and that happens all the time.
Tesla has really become a magnet for criticism in this arena because they've brought the Silicon Valley startup model of, quote, move fast and break things to the world of self-driving cars. It's one thing if you're launching a photo-sharing app and it breaks. No harm, no foul. But a self-driving car that breaks can literally kill people. Widely speaking, companies in this arena are taking two approaches to the marketplace. On the one hand, you have companies like Tesla that are trying to develop and release self-driving capabilities that can in principle be used anywhere you take your car. On the other, you have companies like Waymo and Cadillac that are much more cautious. Waymo self-driving cars only operate within certain geographic regions and on roads they've carefully mapped in advance. And Cadillac's self-driving capabilities are only enabled on the freeway and in perfect weather conditions. And it's useful to take a closer look at what we're calling self-driving, because different companies mean different things when they use that term. The Society of Automotive Engineers has defined a 6-level system of autonomy. At level 0, there's no automation at all. Think of your father's Chrysler, and that was at level 0. Level 1 includes hands-on automation, so something like cruise control, parking assistance, or emergency braking. At level 2, we get hands-off, partial automation within specific circumstances. The vehicle can drive the car, but the driver has to closely monitor the situation and be prepared to intervene at any moment. Cadillac cars today equipped with what they call Super Cruise have level 2 automation. On the freeway, the car will keep you in the center of the lane and maintain a safe distance from other cars. Tesla's autopilot is also level 2, or arguably level 2.5. Level 2 is, by the way, the most dangerous period within the development of autonomous cars because the driver is still responsible for safe operation of the vehicle, but the self-driving capabilities of that car can lull you into a false sense of security. Looking back at the 14 people who died in connection with a Tesla autopilot crash, we can safely say that some of them would be alive today if the drivers had not overestimated the capabilities of their car.
Yeah.
At level 3, we get eyes-off automation. The car will handle steering and velocity, and it will deal autonomously with emergency situations, such as emergency braking. But if it encounters situations it is not programmed to deal with, it will alert the driver and hand off the responsibilities for controlling the car. Newer Honda vehicles in Japan are equipped with a feature called Traffic Jam Pilot. If you're stuck traveling at low speeds in a traffic jam, you can let the car deal with that. When the jam clears and speeds pick up, the car will alert you and hand off the driving. At level 4, you get mind-off automation. Under the right conditions and or within a certain area, the car can get you from point A to point B completely by itself. Waymo offers a self-driving taxi service in Phoenix and San Francisco that, operating only on pre-approved roads, gets you where you want to go in a driverless car. In principle, this is level 4, but it's still experimental. The car is remotely monitored by a human being who can intervene at any moment.
Like a drone pilot.
Yes, exactly. Tesla also offers a feature where you can summon your parked car to drive over and pick you up, like maybe pick you up at the door of a restaurant, but this only works within a limited range. And then there's level 5. This is Jetson-level automation, where your car is so self-sufficient that it might not even have a driver's wheel. This is probably still decades away, but in the meantime, the cars are clearly getting better. By state law, companies testing self-driving cars in California streets have to report the number of miles driven and the total number and reason for disengagements, where a disengagement is when a human driver had to take over from the self-driving AI. In 2020, Waymo reported that its cars drove nearly 630,000 miles on California streets, which was down from 1.5 million in 2019, no doubt for pandemic-related reasons. Also in 2020, Waymo reported a disengagement every 30,000 miles, which was a better than twofold improvement over their 2019 rate, when there was a disengagement every 13,000 miles. But as the cars get better, it poses an interesting liability question. So let's consider a hypothetical scenario. Let's say you are the owner of a self-driving car. And for the sake of argument, let's say it's a Volvo that is equipped with Waymo technology. If the car has an accident, who's at fault? Is it you, the owner of the car, and the one responsible for taking it out on the road and activating the software? Is it Volvo, the company that built the car, licensed the technology, and advertised its self-driving capabilities? Or is it Waymo, which designed the software that might have had a defect that led to the crash? If you answer that question in a way that heaps too much liability on any one of those parties, you could hold back or prevent the development of autonomous cars. Drivers may not be willing to buy the cars if they'll be held responsible for decisions that software makes. Automakers may not design or sell the cars if they'll be on the hook for big damage settlements. And technology companies may avoid this marketplace entirely if their neural networks might come back to bite them, possibly many, many years after the software was developed. So what do you think, Joe? Who would you hold most responsible?
You know, I'm not sure. I was pondering that while you were speaking. I do know that a good lawyer will sue all three parties and settle with the deepest pocket, which is probably going to be the technology car company or the technology company and not the human driver. But I'm not sure. This seems like something we really need to see it operate in the real world before we get a sense of who or what is truly in control. From the levels of autonomy you mentioned, it sounds like in the current day we're somewhere between 2 and 4. Right? Nobody's reached 5 yet. But one interesting tidbit I heard, I think when you were describing level 3, is that the car will negotiate certain things it's capable of handling, and then it will alert the driver, you kept saying, when it's time for the driver to step in, whatever the reason is. It seems to me, just off the top of my head, using common sense, that alert is vitally, vitally important. Because the driver is likely to be texting or watching a video, like you said in that earlier example, or doing something stupid and not paying attention. And if that alert isn't absolutely reliable, then I think that's just a recipe for disaster.
Right. And a very important ingredient of the alert is how much time does it give the driver to return his or her attention to what's going on the road.
Yes.
If it's an alert,
yes.
like you have a half second to take control of this car, then that's a useless alert. I would imagine that you would need, just minimum a couple seconds, 2 to 3 seconds, just to realize what's going on before you can responsibly make a decision about what to do.
Right.
In any case, we are at level 2 and heading into level 3 now, and we'll probably see companies pushing into L4 within a few years. Waymo will predictably expand its service areas, while Tesla, Cadillac, and other companies will improve the capabilities of their cars. We'll probably see driver-free vehicles first in relatively controlled environments. Think about the shuttle buses at airports and amusement parks, which drive predictable routes and have a limited number of variables to deal with. In regular cars, the situation will probably be like smartphones today. In some areas, you have a great connection and your phone does everything it's supposed to do. In others, the network connection is a step down. You can still make calls and read your email, but you might not be able to stream a video. And then in some areas, you can barely get a signal. So it will go with your car. It may be L4 on the highway, L3 in the city, and L2 when you're out camping or in the middle of a snowstorm. But will we ever get to L5? If we don't see a dramatic leap in artificial intelligence, allowing for the sort of fuzzy logic that human brains are so good at, that could take a very long time. There's a principle in engineering called the 80-20 rule, which says that 80% of your effort goes into the last 20% of the project. That's because you tend to solve the easy problems first, and as you go along, the remaining challenges become more and more difficult to solve. Instead of a straight line of development, it's actually a curve, and the slope of the difficulty curve at the very end can be very steep. For us to get perfect self-driving cars, we'll need them to handle all weather conditions and navigate ably around debris on the road, animals crossing unexpectedly, potholes, police officers giving hand signals, as you mentioned, emergency vehicles with their flashing lights, construction zones.
Yeah, people pushing bicycles, like you said earlier.
Exactly. The list goes on, and that would be everywhere within the world, every region. I would argue, though, that perfect is the wrong target. All we really need is for self-driving cars to be safer than human drivers. Every year, over 35,000 people in the U.S. die in motor vehicle accidents, and that includes nearly 7,000 pedestrians and cyclists. Worldwide, nearly 1.5 million people die in crashes every single year, and that doesn't count trucks and buses, which pile up their own fatality figures. Estimates are that about 95% of all car crashes are the result of human error. Self-driving cars could turn drunk driving and road rage into historical relics. They could unlock mobility for entire classes of our population. I, for one, look forward to this day. I recognize that there are challenges and that there have been some questionable decisions along the way, but I remain invested in this technology. How about you?
Boy, I'm still kind of stuck on your earlier claim that self-driving doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be better than the alternative. You'll get no argument from me that the driving of cars, traffic-related accidents, are a scourge in our society and we need to cut them down and avoid them however possible. I myself live in a big city. I gave up my car years ago. I look forward to not driving cars, only do it when it's absolutely necessary. So I've drunk that Kool-Aid, right? You get no argument from me about that. But I want to push back on this idea that the self-driving car just needs to be better than the human alternative. Because the future that's likely to emerge, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, is that we'll have a lot of self-driving cars on the road, but it won't be all self-driving cars. So doesn't the safety benefit of self-driving cars depend on everybody using them? Because the computer could be absolutely perfect, but if the other car is driven by some idiot who's texting, the accident is still going to happen, right?
Right. There will still be accidents where a fully compliant AI-driven car is smashed into by an irresponsible human driver. That's going to happen. But I tend to come at this from someone who mostly encounters cars as a pedestrian and as a bicyclist. And some of the things that I've seen have been kind of disturbing. The other day, I was waiting to cross a light. And when the light changed, I caught some movement out of the corner of my eye, so I didn't step into the intersection, and it's good that I didn't, because a moment later, a U-Haul truck just plowed right through the space where I would have been standing.
Wow.
And as the truck went by, the driver casually made eye contact with me. So he wasn't distracted. He wasn't on his cell phone. He wasn't watching the streaming video. He knew I was there, and he didn't seem to care. And that's the sort of thing that I look forward to no longer seeing on the roads, because the computer driver is just trying to get from point A to point B. He's not dealing with road rage. He's not angry at his father. He doesn't feel like his masculinity is challenged by other drivers on the road. The computer is just trying to avoid obstacles and get you to where you want to go.
Right.
And I feel like that's got to be better.
Yeah, I have no argument with that. You're right about that. There are two other questions I want to ask you, two other points I want to make. One is, with self-driving cars relying on such intricate software that's controlled from Tesla or Waymo headquarters, and I've heard about them sending like software updates out to their whole system of cars. So you don't go in for a tune-up, you just get the software update and your car can all of a sudden do whatever the new feature is that the company has developed, right? But it seems to me a system like that would be very vulnerable to hacking, right? What if the Russians or some other terrorist organization got into the system and changed the software to, say, make the car accelerate when it should be stopping? That would be a catastrophe of the first order. It seems like just the kind of thing that would happen in this 21st century world we live in right now.
No, that's a real thing. That could be an actual vulnerability. Anything that is delivered over the air can in principle be hacked. And so, yeah, it's possible that your car could get hacked. I don't necessarily see that as an obstacle to self-driving cars, because there's the same vulnerability that people have been talking about in our power grid, that can be hacked.
Right.
And, that's not an obstacle to using electricity. We just go about our lives and hope that the authorities are in some way dealing with us. And so I think likewise we would hope that a company that has the sophistication of a Tesla, which is not just making cars but also sending rocket ships into space, you would hope that that sort of company would have the sophistication to guard against easy hacking by third-party actors. But yeah, I don't have any proof one way or the other of whether or not they're doing that work. It's just sort of the thing that we would hope.
Right.
We would wait to see how it plays out in the marketplace.
Okay, fair enough. But then I have a kind of a larger big picture point, which kind of undergirds my skepticism about self-driving cars. You may recall, Mark, when I teed up this question for you last time, at the end of our last episode, I analogized it to something Coca-Cola did in the 1980s. That seems like a crazy analogy, but I want to explain it in more detail what I meant by that, and I want to get your reaction to this. I didn't make that remark about Coca-Cola to be cute. I said it because I think it might be a useful framework for grappling with the phenomenon of self-driving cars. And not from a safety perspective, but from the perspective of whether people actually want this new product. Okay, so let me take a minute and explain my thinking. In the 1980s, when Coca-Cola replaced its old product with what became known as New Coke, it was worried about its customers migrating over to Pepsi. Remember the Pepsi challenge? That was a very popular taste test. So Coke changed, as I understand it, Coke changed its proprietary formula to create a new version of Coke that tasted more like Pepsi. And instead of simply introducing it as a new flavor, it canceled its existing product, which later became known as Coke Classic. And it made New Coke the only Coke you could buy. That was an unmitigated disaster. Millions of people were loyal to Coke Classic, and I was one of them. Nobody was interested in replacing the tried and true with something new. So eventually, New Coke went the way of the dodo bird, and Coke Classic was again the dominant product. So I think driving a car with your hands gripping the steering wheel is like Coke Classic in that way. It's the tried and true. Countless paeans have been written about how driving is an expression of freedom, autonomy, the lure of the open road, all that jazz. Owning and operating one's own car seems existentially important to many, many people. It's a product that already has a deep well of customer allegiance, and some of that allegiance is almost reverential. It's Coke Classic, basically, is my contention. And now along comes some genius who knows better and wants to take the steering wheel out of your hands by making your car fully autonomous. And that company's betting that driverless cars will completely replace cars driven by human beings. But I think, as with New Coke, nobody was clamoring for this change. Everyone seemed perfectly happy with the status quo, and I wonder, Mark, whether the result of this experiment will be exactly the same as with New Coke. I just don't see people who love to drive relinquishing control and allowing their cars to essentially become robot taxis. Your thoughts?
It's a good point. I do wonder how many true automotive enthusiasts there are and what a percentage of the market that is. Because consider automatic transmission versus stick. And the driving enthusiast who you talk about is driving a stick shift right now. Like, he really wants to have that degree of control. There are definitely people who buy stick shifts, but the majority of the market is automatic transmission at this point. And then there's things like cruise control, which is a thing that's available in most cars at this point, and that is, to some degree, a self-driving element.
Yeah, true.
My apartment gives this beautiful view of I-5, the interstate that stretches from Washington through Oregon and down into California. And that means that on a daily basis, I get to see all the people who are stuck in traffic jams on the freeway. And there is a traffic jam every single day on I-5.
That doesn't sound like a beautiful view, Mark.
No, and so even if you love the experience of driving out on the open road, most people don't drive out on the open road that much. They're driving on city streets from point A to point B, trying to get a carton of milk or going to work. And there was a happiness study a few decades ago where people gave beepers out to the subjects. And at random intervals, they would beep them and ask, so what are you doing right now? And what's your degree of happiness or satisfaction? And the number one source of unhappiness in people's lives was their daily commute to work, by far. What is the commute for people except driving the same road that you've been driving for 10 or 15 years, getting stuck in traffic, stressing about whether or not you can be able to get to work on time, stressing about the fact that you're stuck in traffic when you're trying to get home and you're hungry and tired and it's all just a pain in the neck. I think a lot of people would be pretty happy if they could just hand it over to a car, watch a movie on Netflix, or close their eyes to rest. I feel like a lot of people would hand over significant portions of their driving experience right now, even if they're within the camp of people who think that one of the great pieces of romance within American life right now is driving a stick over the hilly regions outside of Los Angeles.
Okay, touche, fair point. But I think the key words you said in your last sentence were substantial portion of their driving. So maybe what's likely to happen, even when there is L5 capability, is people will gladly turn over the drive on I-5 to work or through the Holland or Lincoln Tunnel by me, right? That part will be turned over to the software. But once you're on the open road or you're driving to the lake for your holiday getaway or whatever, I have a feeling people are not going to click on the auto driving option and are going to instead keep the hands on the steering wheel themselves, which I don't think you can mandate that they use the self-driving aspect, and people are not going to do it all the time. And so that's going to undermine a lot of the safety claims made by the makers of such cars.
I would say it would undermine some of the safety claims, because what's the statistic? 50% of accidents happen within 5 miles of your home. Those are the miles that you're not going to be driving by yourself.
Yeah.
Like, even if you are the freedom of the open road type person, you're probably going to send your kids to soccer practice in a self-driving car so that you don't have to do it. Like you said, it's going to be something that you turn to when you want to instead of when you need to. And then I will bet that insurance companies will very much bring the hammer down on people who chose to turn off the self-driving capabilities of their car and then got in an accident. That will be the first question that insurance companies will ask is, were you operating the vehicle or was the vehicle under its own operation? And if the telemetry of your car shows that you had turned off the software, then insurance might not cover the damages. And that will convince a lot of people that unless they have the road to themselves, that they should just let the car handle it.
That's interesting. Maybe so. And it also underscores how there's a lot of litigation and regulation and red tape that still has to be navigated before these rules go into effect, which reminds me of another thing I read in the New York Times story yesterday about Tesla. It seems like Tesla is trying to evade federal regulations by issuing non-disclosure agreements to the people who test its cars so that they can't report their safety concerns to federal agencies. That's the kind of thing that will need to get hashed out before these cars really take their place with the L4, L5 level of technology on our roads. Well, thanks. That was really interesting.
You feel like I answered your question?
I do, yes. My skepticism was kind of well-founded, so I think if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is, this is coming, Joe, but it's not coming anytime really soon. And so the skepticism about the imminence of this is probably well-founded, right?
Yeah, and it's not a binary. It's not a shift from cars that you completely have to drive yourself to suddenly the car does everything. It'll arrive in phases, in bits and pieces. It will be rolled out bit by bit rather than all at once.
Okay, you have a question for me.
I'd like to ask a question about something that's a big part of my life right now. My wife and I are looking to move into a new apartment. We've been living in a shoebox for more than 10 years, and working at home during the pandemic made it feel really cramped. So now we're looking for a bigger place, and every time I check the listings, I'm reminded of the high cost of housing. It's a long-term problem here in Seattle. We're already paying a lot for the shoebox we've been living in, and all signs are it's only getting worse. It's the same situation in most urban areas in the country. So my question to you, Joe, what forces are driving up the cost of housing in this country? And is there anything other than legislative rent control or moving out of the city that we can do about it?
Interesting. Yeah, well, I live in one of the most expensive places on earth, and that's certainly been an issue in my adult life as well. So, yeah, I'll dive into that, and hopefully the answer will help both of us down the road. Okay, folks, if you like this episode of Mansplaining, or if you want to leave a comment about this one or any other episode, we ask that you go to our Facebook page. It's called Mansplaining the Podcast. You can find it easily. We welcome your feedback, positive or negative. We welcome topic ideas for future episodes. That's also where we post our sources for each episode. You can like us there if you're so inclined. Just please do it. But until next time, that's all for this edition of Mansplaining. That was Mark and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you next time. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.